This is Section 9 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Reliable Contraband. New York Press Club Dinner, Delmonico's, June 5, 1869. Delivered by proxy. Mr. President and gentlemen, I thank you most heartily. That is, I am happy in being considered worthy to. In truth, gentlemen, I am unprepared to make a speech. This call is entirely unexpected, I assure you. I did not expect it. That is, I did not expect to be called upon. If I had expected to be called upon, I would have prepared myself, but not being, as I may say, entirely unprepared, and not expecting it, it is entirely unexpected to me, and I am entirely unprepared. But I thank you very kindly, I assure you. However, at this moment a thought occurs to me. I will offer a sentiment and preface it with a few subsequent remarks which I hope to be able to make in the interim, if the theme shall chance to suggest to me anything to say. I beg that you will fill your private memorandum to recollect to take notice, at this point, whether these fellows are drinking out of gourds, goblets, jugs, or what they are drinking out of, and so not make any stupid blunder and spoil the effect of the speech. And join me in a toast. To one whose eminent services in time of great national peril we gratefully acknowledge, whose memory we revere, whose death we deplore, the journalist's truest friend, the late Reliable Contraband. Mr. President and gentlemen, it is my painful duty to mar these festivities with the announcement of the death of one who was dear to us all, our tried and noble friend, the Reliable Contraband. To the world at large this event will bring no sorrow, for the world never comprehended him, never knew him as we did, never had such cause to love him. But unto us the calamity brings unutterable anguish, for it heralds the loss of one whose great heart beat for us alone, whose tireless tongue vibrated in our interest only, whose fervent fancy wrought its miracles solely for our enrichment and renown. In his time what did he not do for us? When marvels languished and sensation dispatches grew tame, who was it that laid down the shovel and the hoe and came with healing on his wings? The Reliable Contraband. When armies fled in panic and dismay, and the great cause seemed lost beyond all hope of succor, who was it that turned the tide of war and gave victory to the vanquished? The Reliable Contraband. When despair hung its shadows about the hearts of the people, and sorrow sat upon every face, who was it that braved every danger to bring cheering and incomprehensible news from the front? The Reliable Contraband. Who took Richmond the first time? The Reliable Contraband. Who took it the second time? The Reliable Contraband. Who took it every time until the last, and then felt the bitterness of hearing a nation applaud the man more who took it once than that greater man who had taken it 6 times before? The Reliable Contraband. When we needed a bloodless victory, whom did we look to win it? The Reliable Contraband. when we needed news to make the people's bowels yearn and their knotted and combined locks to stand on end like quills upon the fretful porcupine, whom did we look to fetch it? The reliable contraband. When we needed any sort or description of news upon any sort or description of subject, who was it that stood always ready to steal a horse and bring that news along? The reliable contraband. My friends, he was the faithfulest vassal that ever fought, bled, and lied in the glorious ranks of journalism. Thunder and lightning never stopped him. Annihilated railroads never delayed him. The telegraph never overtook him. Military secrecy never crippled his knowledge. Strategic feints never confused his judgment. Cannonballs couldn't kill him. Clairvoyance couldn't find him. Satan himself couldn't catch him. His information comprised all knowledge, possible and impossible. His imagination was utterly boundless. His capacity to make mighty statements and so back them up as to make an inch of truth cover an acre of ground without appearing to stretch or tear was a thing that appalled even the most unimpressible with its awful grandeur. The reliable contraband is no more. Born of the war, and a necessity of the war, and of the war only, he watched its progress, took note of its successes and reverses, manufactured and recorded the most thrilling features of its daily history, and then, when it died, his great mission was fulfilled, his occupation gone, and he died likewise. No journalist here present can lay his hand upon his heart and say he had not cause to love this faithful creature over whose unsentient form we drop these unavailing tears. For no journalist among us all can lay his hand upon his heart and say he ever lied with such pathos, such unction, such exquisite symmetry, such sublimity of conception, and such felicity of execution, as when he did it through and by the inspiration of this regally gifted marvel of mendacity, the lamented reliable contraband. Peace to his ashes. End of Reliable Contraband, read by John Greenman. This is Section 10 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Artemus Ward Lecture, Lecture Season 1871-72. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask leave to introduce to you the lecturer of the evening, Mr. Charles F. Clemens, otherwise known as Mark Twain, a gentleman, I may say, whose devotion to science, aptness in philosophy, historical accuracy, and love of truth are in perfect harmony with his majestic and imposing appearance. I refer indirectly to myself. It is not, I know, customary to introduce a lecturer after having the amount of advertising that I have had, but as the management desired that the introduction should be made, I preferred making it myself, being sure by this means of getting in all the facts. My lecture is about Artemus Ward, who was one of the great humorists of our age. When I first started out on this missionary tour, it was my intention to touch in my lecture upon a number of other uncommonplace characters I have met: Bunyan, Martin Luther, Milton, and a few others. But I find that to mention all these old fellows, the companions of my childish hours, takes a great deal too much time, and therefore I confine myself to the single great man whom I have named. It is my purpose to show that Artemus Ward was America's greatest humorist, not manufactured or bogus, but a born humorist, and I will give you a skeleton outline—I have not time for more—of his life. In this outline I shall not load you down with historic facts to such an extent that you will be unable to get home with them, nor will I even make for you any of my philosophical deductions. This last promise is, on my part, a sacrifice, for I admire my philosophical deductions as I admire few other things on earth. Strange as it may seem, I have always found that the effect produced by them upon an audience was that of intense and utter exasperation. Artemus Ward was a humorist from the cradle to the grave. We cannot indeed go back to his cradle, but very early in life we find him perpetrating a witticism. The circumstances were these. When Artemus Ward was very young, he and a companion got hold of a pack of cards and learned to play euchre. Artemus was perfectly fascinated with the game, and played it as often as he had an opportunity. But it had to be done on the sly, and he had to hide his cards from his parents. So, when he was looking around for a place to hide them, the boys thought the safest place where they could put the cards was in the pocket of the minister's black gown, under the very aegis of the church. I don't know what aegis means, but it's a good word, and I suppose it's all right. Well, the old minister was called on to baptize a convert, and as he went down into the water wearing the gown, the cards began to come up to the surface and float off. The boys, who were on the bank watching, though in great fear, kept their eyes on the cards. As it happened, there came up first 2 bowers and 3 aces. Of course the boys were thrashed, and an old aunt of Artemus's proceeded to lecture him on the enormity of his crime. "Why," said she, "just imagine how the poor man must have felt when he saw the cards coming up. I should have thought he would have fainted, and I don't see how he got out." "Well," said Artemus, "I don't see how he could help going out on such a hand." Artemus Ward's real name, as most of you are probably aware, was Charles F. Brown. He was born in Waterford, Maine, in 1834. His personal appearance was not like that of most Maine men. He looked like a glove-stretcher. His hair, red, and brushed well forward at the sides, reminded one of a divided flame. His nose rambled on aggressively before him, with all the strength and determination of a cow-catcher, while his red mustache, to follow out the simile, seemed not unlike the unfortunate cow. He was of Puritan descent, and prided himself not a little on being derived from that stern old stock of people who had left their country and home for the sake of having freedom on a foreign shore to enjoy their own religion, and, at the same time, to prevent other folks from enjoying theirs. I don't know whether it is treasonable to speak in this way about those reverend old chaps, the Pilgrim Fathers. I am a Puritan father myself. At least, I am descended from one. One of my ancestors cut a conspicuous figure in the Boston Massacre, fighting first on one side and then on the other. He wasn't a man to stand fooling around while a massacre was going on. Why, to hear our family talk, you'd think that not a man named anything but Twain was in that massacre, and when you came to hear all about it, you'd wish that such was the case. Then I had another ancestor in the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was everything that an ancestor of mine was: killed, wounded, and missing. He was a prompt, businesslike fellow, and to make sure of being the last of the three, he did it first of all, did it well, too. He was prompt that way, before a shot was fired. Why, I could stand here for a week and tell you of my distinguished ancestors, and I think I'll do it. On second thoughts, I think I won't, but go back to my subject. Ward never had any regular schooling. He was too poor to afford it, for one thing, and too lazy to care for it, for another. He had an intense, ingrained dislike for work of any kind. He even objected to see other people work, and on one occasion went so far as to submit to the authorities of a certain town an invention to run a treadmill by steam. Such a notion could not have originated with a hard-hearted man. Ward was a dutiful man, and his first act, when money began to come in on him from his lectures, was to free from encumbrance the old homestead in his native town and settle it upon his aged mother. Besides having wit and brilliant scintillations of happy fancies, Artemus possessed genuine humor. He once took an old Queen Anne musket and loaded it according to directions given by a hired man. The directions were to put in a handful of powder or so, a handful of bullets or so, a handful of nails or so. Ward did as he was told, only he had to take out a few of the bullets to make room for the nails. The gun being loaded, the boy went into the woods to shoot it off. But, soon as his hand got to the trigger, his courage failed, and finally he came home with the gun unfired, and handed it in that state to his father. The father sighted a sapling and let drive. The result was a small earthquake. Old Mr. Ward was laid up for a week. The senile gentleman, upon recovering, asked his son to come forward. He questioned him about the loading of the fowling piece, why he didn't make a report. The precocious youth replied he supposed that the gun would report for itself, and so it did. That was enough. While still young, he apprenticed himself to a printer in Skowhegan. Artemus was pleased with the place, and used often to pronounce the name. It reminded him so much of the names of old Spain and Portugal, because it was so different. About the age of 16 he went to Boston, and got on Mrs. Partington's carpet-bagger. Then it was that he wrote his first piece, and dropped it stealthily into the office, and how proud he felt next day when they gave it to him to set up. Then he commenced to write, and write generally. He touched everything. He even wrote a column of a scientific essay, entitled "Is Cats Useful?" and sent it to the Smithsonian Institute. He tired of settled life and poor pay in Boston, and wandered off over the country to better his fortune, obtaining a position in Cleveland as a reporter at $12 a week. It was while in Cleveland that he wrote his first badly spelled article, signing it Artemus Ward. He did not think much of it at the time of writing it, but it gave him a start that speedily sent him to the top of the ladder without touching a single run. Here he made himself well known in his particular line. Alluding to a very slow railroad, he said that the railroad was a breeder of injustice. He told of a convict who was started to the jail at the end of the road, but got so old while going he did not answer the description when he got there. Speaking of this same road, he once told the conductor the cowcatcher should be at the other end. There the danger lay. "You can't," said he, "overtake a cow, but what's to hinder one walking in the back door and biting the passengers?" The wit of Mr. Ward was very lively. He was a great humorist, nevertheless. True, he must not be compared with Holmes or Lowell. These men have a refinement that he did not possess. But this does not detract from the great showman's ability to create fun for the million. The flood tide of his popularity soon bore Artemus to New York, where, for a time, he infused new life into the columns of Vanity Fair, a comic journal published in that city. The quickening was but for a time, and the paper had already entered upon that rapid decline which every American comic journal seems destined to, even in its early youth. Artemus watched Vanity Fair in its death agonies, saw it expire, and said above its grave that he had always been of the opinion that an occasional joke improved a comic paper. Some of the best things attributed to Artemus Ward were not his. Indeed, his celebrated expression, "It would be $10 in Jeff Davis's pocket if he had never been born," I found in an English author who wrote some 50 years ago. Pounds were substituted for dollars, and some other name appeared in the place of Jeff Davis. Again, in one of his lectures, Ward used to say that to be attached to anything did not argue good feeling toward it, for he knew of a horse being attached to a dray and yet being down on that dray. A Western journalist told me that this witticism was not original with Artemus Ward, but that he himself was the author of it. But in spite of this, Ward must not be regarded as a plagiarist. It is possible for a man to write what he thinks is a creation, but which is in fact only a memory. And it is also possible for two minds at different times to happen on the same idea. Holmes bears witness to this in The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table. I myself have written what I thought was my own, have imagined that I have created something clever and really good, and found out afterwards that the whole thing had been filched from me years and years before by Josephus. The idea of lecturing then occurred to Artemus. The success of this new employment, although not great at first, soon exceeded his most sanguine expectations, and he adopted it as a permanent profession. The lectures which Ward delivered with so much success all over the country were without form or consistence or sequence. His first one he called The Babes in the Wood. But My 7 Grandmothers, the name he originally intended to give it, would have been equally appropriate for anything there was in the lecture. At Christmas time in 1861 he opened his Babes in New York, and subsequently in California and elsewhere. His profits during that season amounted to something like $30,000 or $40,000, a very considerable sum for that day, but a gas fitter on the New York courthouse does better than that now. His success as a lecturer depended even more on the manner than on the matter. His inimitable way of pausing and hesitating, of gliding in a moment from seriousness to humor without appearing to be conscious of so doing, cannot be reproduced, so that many of his best things read flat and tame in consequence. It was unkind to report him. There was more in his pauses than in his words, and so no reporter's pen could do him justice. Having lectured for 3 months in California, Artemus went over to England, and opened with his Panorama in Egyptian Hall, London, and lectured to the nobility as well as common people. His success was so great that he threatened at one time to compel the royal family to remain away from his exhibition. Some of the pictures in his exhibition were most wretchedly painted. Of one of the pictures, that of some impossible animal, he assured his audience that some of the greatest artists in the city came to the hall every morning before daybreak with lanterns to inspect it. They say they never saw anything like it before, and hope they never will again. He was always tender-footed in matters of criticism. He said that some people found fault and slurred at him for not saying things like Edward Everett. "Why are they so one-sided?" he asked. "Edward Everett ought to be slurred some, I think, because he can't make a speech like me." In England Ward was heartily received, and his efforts to please were very successful, but the climate of cold and fog seemed to have the effect of eating away his life, and although he struggled hard, he had to relinquish his vocation. He lectured until his health was in such condition that he was nightly attended by his physician at the theater. One night in January, 4 years ago, the people found the doors of Egyptian Hall closed against them. When he knew that he must die, his only desire was to get home, but this was denied him. He got as far as Southampton, but his physician peremptorily forbade his attempting the sea voyage, and at Southampton, on the 6th of March, 1867, in the 34th year of his age, he died. Death at any time is sad, but under such circumstances as these it wrings the sigh of pity from every heart. Artemus Ward. Is he gone to the land of no laughter, this man that made mirth for us all? Proves death but a silence hereafter from the sounds that delight or appall? Once closed, have the lips no more duty, no more pleasure the exquisite ears? Has the heart done o'erflowing with beauty, as the eyes have with tears? Nay, if aught be sure, what can be surer than that earth's good decays not with earth? And of all the heart's springs none are purer than the springs of the fountain of mirth. He that sounds them has pierced the heart's hollows, the place where tears are and sleep. For the foam flakes that dance in life's shallows are wrung from life's deep. He came with a heart full of gladness, from the glad-hearted world of the West, won our laughter, but not with mere madness, spake and joked with us, not in mere jest, for the pain in our hearts lingered after, when the merriment dies from our ears, and those that were loudest in laughter are silent in tears. Ladies and gentlemen, my subject made it necessary for me to allude to death at all times solemn, and never to be approached with levity. As this is the case, I think it more conducive to your and my own self-respect to stop here than to end my remarks by a flippant or ill-timed jest or jibe. Thanking you all very kindly for your presence and marks of approbation, I bid you a good night. End of Artemus Ward lecture Read by John Greenman. This is Section 11 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Roughing It Lecture. Lecture Season 1871-1872. England, 1873. Read by John Greenman. Ladies and gentlemen, by request of the chairman of the committee, who has been very busy, and is very tired, I suppose, I ask leave to introduce to you the lecturer of the evening, Mr. Clemens, otherwise Mark Twain, a gentleman whose great learning, whose historical accuracy, whose devotion to science, and whose veneration for the truth are only equaled by his high moral character and his majestic presence. I refer, in these vague and general terms, to myself. I am a little opposed to the custom of ceremoniously introducing a lecturer to an audience, partly because it seems to me that it is not entirely necessary where a man has been pretty well advertised, and partly because it makes a lecturer feel uncomfortably awkward. But where it is necessary I would much rather make it myself. Then I can get in all the facts. But it is not really the introduction that I care for. I don't care about that. That don't discommode me. But it's the compliments that sometimes go with it. That's what hurts. It would hurt anybody. The idea of a young lady being introduced into society as the sweetest singer or the finest conversationalist. You might as well knock her in the head at once. She could not say a word the rest of the evening. I never had but one public introduction that seemed to me just exactly the thing, an introduction brimful of grace. Why, it was a sort of inspiration, and yet the man who made it wasn't acquainted with me. But he was sensible to the backbone, and he said to me, "Now you don't want any compliments?" I said he was exactly right. I didn't want any compliments. And when he introduced me, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I shan't fool away any unnecessary time in this introduction. I don't know anything about this man. At least, I know only two things. One is that he has never been in the penitentiary, and the other is I don't know why." Such an introduction as that puts a man at his ease right off. Now, when I first started out on this missionary expedition, I had a lecture which I liked very well, but by and by I got tired of telling that same old stuff over and over again, and then I got up another lecture, and after that another one, and I am tired of that, so I just thought tonight I would try something fresh, if you are willing. I don't suppose you care what a lecturer talks about, if he only tells the truth, at intervals. Now, I have got a book in press. It will be out pretty soon, over 600 octavo pages, and illustrated after the fashion of The Innocents Abroad. Terms, however, I am not around canvassing for the work. I should like to talk a little of that book to you tonight. It is very fresh in my mind, as it is not more than 3 months since I wrote it. Say 30 or 40 pages, or if you prefer it, the whole 600. 10 or 12 years ago I crossed the continent from Missouri to California in the old overland stage coach, a good while before the Pacific Railway was built. Over 1,900 miles. It was a long ride, day and night, through sagebrush, over sand and alkali plains, wolves and Indians, starvation and smallpox, everything to make the journey interesting. Had a splendid time, a most enjoyable pleasure trip, in that old stagecoach. We were bound for Nevada, which was then a brand new territory nearly or about as large as the state of Ohio. It was a desolate, barren, sterile, mountainous, unpeopled country, sagebrush and deserts of alkali. You could scarcely cast your eye in any direction but your gaze would be met by one significant object, and that was the projecting horns of a dried, shrunken carcass of an ox, preaching eloquent sermons of the hardships suffered by those emigrants, where a soil refused to clothe its nakedness, except now and then a little rill, or as you might call it, a river, goes winding through the plain. Such is the Carson River, which clothes the valley with refreshing and fragrant hayfields. However, hay is a scant crop, and with all the importations from California the price of that article has never come under $300 a ton. In the winter the price reaches $800, and once went up to $1,200 per ton, and then the cattle were turned out to die, and it is hardly putting the figures too strong to say that the valleys were paved with the remains of these cattle. It is a land where the winters are long and rigorous, where the summers are hot and scorching, and where not a single drop of rain ever falls during 11 tedious months, where it never thunders and never lightens, where no river finds its way to the sea or empties its waters into the great lakes that have no perceptible outlet, and whose surplus waters are spirited through mysterious channels down into the ground. A territory broad and ample, but which has not yet had a population numbering 80,000, yet a country that produced $20 million of silver bullion in the year 1863, and produces $12 million to $16 million every year. Yet the population has fallen away until now it does not number more than 15,000 or 18,000. Yet that little handful of people vote just as strongly as they do anywhere, are just as well represented in the Senate of the United States as Michigan or the great state of New York, with her 3 million or 4 million of people. That is equality in representation. I spoke of the sagebrush. That is a particular feature of the country out there. It's an interesting sort of shrub. You see no other sort of vegetable, and clear from Pike's Peak to California's edge the sagebrushes stand from 3 to 6 feet apart, one vast greenish-gray sea of sagebrush. It was the emigrant's fast friend, his only resource for fuel. In its appearance it resembles a venerable live oak, with its rough bark and knotty trunk, everything twisted and dwarfed, covered with its thick foliage. I think the sagebrush are beautiful. One at a time is, anyway. Of course, when you see them as far as the eye can reach, 7 days and a half in the week, it is different. I am not trying to get up an excitement over sagebrush, but there are many reasons why it should have some mention, from an appreciative friend. I grant you that as a vegetable for table use sagebrush is a failure. Its leaves taste like our ordinary sage. You can make sage tea of it, but anybody in this audience who has ever been a boy or a girl, or both, in a country where doctors were scarce and measles and grandmothers plenty, don't hanker after sage tea. And yet, after all, there was a manifest providence in the creation of sagebrush, for it is food for the mules and donkeys, and therefore many emigrant trains are enabled to pull through with their loads where ox teams would lie down and die of starvation. That a mule will eat sagebrush don't prove much, because I know a mule will eat anything. He don't give the toss-up of a copper between oysters, lead pipe, brick dust, or even patent office reports. He takes whatever he can get most of. In our journey we kept climbing and climbing for I don't know how many days and nights. At last we reached the highest eminence, the extreme summit of the great range of the Rocky Mountains, and entered the celebrated South Pass. Now the South Pass is more suggestive of a straight road than a suspension bridge hung in the clouds, though in one place it suggests the latter. One could look below him on the diminishing crags and canyons lying down, down, down away to the vague plain below, with a crooked thread in it, which was the road, and tufts of feathers in it, which were trees, the whole country spread out like a picture, sleeping in the sunlight, and darkness stealing over it, blotting out feature after feature under the frown on a gathering storm. Not a film or shadow to mar the spectator's gaze. I could watch that storm break forth down there, could see the lightnings flash, the sheeted rain drifting along the cannon's side, and hear the thunder crash upon crash, reverberating among 1,000 rocky cliffs. This is a familiar experience to traveling people. It was a miracle of sublimity to a boy like me, who could hardly say that he had ever been away from home a single day in his life before. We visited Salt Lake City in our journey. Carson City, the capital of Nevada, had a wild harum-scarum population of editors, thieves, lawyers, in fact all kinds of blacklegs. Its desperadoes, gamblers, and silver miners were armed to the teeth, every one of them dressed in the roughest kind of costumes, which looked strange and romantic to me, and I was fascinated. Everybody rode horseback in that town. I never saw such magnificent horsemanship as that displayed in Carson streets every day, and I did envy them, though I was not much of a horseman. But I had soon learned to tell a horse from a cow, and was burning with impatience to learn more. I was determined to have a horse and ride myself. Whilst this thought was rankling in my mind, the auctioneer came scouring through the plaza on a black beast that was humped like a dromedary, and fearfully homely. He was going at $22 for horse, saddle, and bridle. A man standing near me, whom I didn't know, but who turned out to be the auctioneer's brother, noticed the wistful look in my eye and observed that that was a remarkable horse to be going at such a price, let alone the saddle and bridle. I said I had half a notion to bid. Now, he says, I know that horse. I know him well. You are a stranger, I take it. You might think he is an American horse, but he is not anything of the kind. He is a Mexican plug. That's what he is, a genuine Mexican plug. But there was something else about that man's way of saying it that made me just determined that I would own a genuine Mexican plug if it took every cent I had, and I said, "Has he any other advantages?" He hooked his forefinger in the pocket of my army shirt and led me to one side, and in a low tone, so that no one else could hear, said, "Shh, don't say a word. He can outbuck any horse in America. He can outbuck any horse in the world." Just then the auctioneer came along. $24 for the horse, saddle, and bridle." I said, "27. Sold." I took the genuine Mexican plug, paid for him, put him in a livery stable, let him get something to eat and get rested, and then in the afternoon I brought him out in the plaza, and some of the citizens held him by the head, and others held him down to the earth by the tail, and I got on him. As soon as those people let go, he put all his feet in a bunch together, let his back sag down, and then he arched it up suddenly and shot me 180 yards, and I came down again, straight down, and lighted in the saddle, and went up again, and when I came down the next time I lit on his neck and seized him, and slid back into the saddle and held on. Then he raised himself straight up in the air on his hind feet and just walked around a while like a member of Congress, and then he came down and went up the other way and just walked around on his hands, just as a schoolboy would. Then he came down on all fours again with the same old process of shooting me up in the air, and the third time I went up I heard a man say, "Oh, don't he buck!" So that was bucking. I was very glad to know it. Not that I was enjoying it, but then I had been taking a general sort of interest in it, and had naturally desired to know what the name of it was. And whilst I was up somebody hit the horse a whack with a strap, and when I came down again the genuine bucker was gone. While this performance was going on, a sympathizing crowd had gathered around, and one of them remarked to me, "Stranger, you have been taken in. That's a genuine Mexican plug." And another one says, "Think of it. You might have bought an American horse, used to all kinds of work, for a very little more money." Well, I didn't want to talk. I didn't have anything to say. I was so jolted up, so internally, externally, and eternally mixed up, gone all to pieces. I put my hand on my forehead and the other on my stomach, and if I had been the owner of 16 hands I could have found a place for every one of them. Now, if you would see the noblest, loveliest inland lake in the world, you should go to Lake Tahoe. It is just on the boundary line between California and Nevada. I have seen some of the world's celebrated lakes, and they bear no comparison with Tahoe. There it is, a sheet of perfectly pure, limpid water, lifted up 6,300 feet above the sea, a vast oval mirror framed in a wall of snow-clad mountain peaks above the common world. Solitude is king, and in that realm calm silence is brooding always. It is the home of rest and tranquillity, and gives emancipation and relief from the griefs and plodding cares of life. Could you but see the morning breaking there, gilding those snowy summits and then creeping gradually along the slopes until it sets the lake and woodlands free from mist, all agleam, you would see old Nature, the master artist, painting those dissolving views on the still water, and finally grouping all these features into a complete picture. Every little dell, the mountains with their dome-turned pinnacles, the cataracts and drifting clouds, are all exquisitely photographed on the burnished surface of the lake, suffused with the softest and richest color. This lake is 10 miles from Carson City, and in company with a friend we used to foot it out there, taking along provisions and blankets, camp out on the lake shore 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Not another human being within miles of us. We used to loaf about in the boat, smoke and read, sometimes play 7-up to strengthen the mind. It's a sinful game, but it's mighty nice. We'd just let the boat drift and drift wherever it wanted to. I can stand a deal of such hardship and suffering when I'm healthy. And the water was so wonderfully clear. Where it was 80 feet deep, the pebbles on the bottom were just as distinct as if you held them in your hand, and in that clear white atmosphere it seemed as if the boat was drifting through the air. Out in the middle it was a deep, dark indigo blue, and the official measurement made by the State Geologist of California shows it to be 1,525 feet deep in the center. You can imagine that it would take a great many churches and steeples piled one upon another before they would be perceptible above its surface. You might use up a great deal of ecclesiastical architecture in that way. Now, notwithstanding that lake is lifted so high among the clouds, surrounded by the everlasting snow-capped mountain peaks, with its surface higher than Mount Washington in the east, and notwithstanding the water is pretty shallow around the edges, yet the coldest winter day in the recollection of humanity was never known to form ice upon its surface. It has no feeders but the little mountain rills, yet it never rises nor falls. Donner Lake, close by, freezes hard every winter. Why Lake Tahoe does not is a question which no scientist has ever been able to explain. If there are any consumptives here, I urge them to go out there, renew their age, make their bodies hale and hearty in the pure, magnificent air of Lake Tahoe. If it don't cure them, I will bury them. I shall be glad to do it. I will give them a funeral that will be a comfort to them as long as they live. But it will cure them. I met a man there. He had been a man once. Now he was nothing but a shadow, and a very poor shadow at that. And that man had come there deliberately to die. And what a sickly failure he made of it. He was in dead earnest. He had heard that this air was easy and soothing to breathe, as God knows it is, and he had simply come out there to have what comfort he might whilst life ebbed away. And he had brought along a plan of his private graveyard, and pictures and drawings of different kinds of coffins and hearses and such things. And he never did anything but sit around and study that graveyard, and figure at coffins, and such things, trying to make up his mind which kind he liked best, or which kind would be most becoming. Well, I met that man 3 months afterward. He was chasing mountain sheep over mountains 7 miles high, with a Sharp's rifle. He didn't get them, but he was chasing them just the same. He had used up his graveyard plans and things for wadding, and had sent home for some more. Such a cure as that was! Why, when I first saw that man his clothes fitted him about as a circus tent fits the tent pole. Now they were snug to him. They stuck to him like postage stamps. And he weighed a ton. Yes, he weighed more than a ton, but I will throw in the odd ounces. I'm not particular about that. 11, I think it was. I know what I am talking about, for I took him to a hay scales and weighed him myself. A lot of us stood on there with him, but really that was a remarkable cure. I have exaggerated it a little. You might not have noticed it, but still it was a cure, and a very remarkable one. I wish you would not heed my nonsense, but simply take note of my earnest word. I think if I could only persuade one invalid to go out there, I should feel as if I had done one thing worth having accomplished. I am really sincere about that. And if there is a sportsman in this audience, I say to him, shoulder your gun and go out there. It is the noblest hunting ground on earth. You can hunt there a year and never find anything, except mountain sheep, but you can't get near enough to shoot one. You can see plenty of them with a spyglass. Of course you can't shoot mountain sheep with a spyglass. It is our American chamois. I believe that is the way the word is pronounced. I don't know. With enormous horns, inhabiting the roughest mountain fastnesses, so exceedingly wild that it is impossible to get within rifle shot of it. There was no other game in that country when I was there except 7-up, though one can see a California quail now and then, a proud, stately, beautiful bird, with a curved and graceful plume on top of its head. But you can't shoot one. You might as well try to kill a cast-iron dog. They don't mind a mortal wound any more than a man would mind a scratch. I had supposed, in my innocence, that silver mining was nice, easy business, and that, of course, silver lay around loose on the hillsides, and that all you had to do was to pick it up, and that you could tell it from any other substance on account of its brightness and its white metallic look. Then came my disappointment, for I found that silver was merely scattered through quartz rock. Gold is found in cement veins, in quartz veins loosely mingled with the earth, in the sand in beds of rivers, but I never heard of any other house or home for silver to live in than quartz rock. This rock is of a dull, whitish color, faintly marked with blue veins. A fine powder of silver ore makes these blue veins, and this yields $30 in bullion. A little dab of silver that I could crowd in my mouth came out of this 2,000 pounds of solid rock. I found out afterward that $30 rock was mighty profitable. Then they showed me some more rock, which was a little more clouded. That was worth $50 a ton. The bluer and darker the rock, the richer it was. Sometimes you could find it worth $400, $500, and $600 a ton. At rare intervals, rock can be found that is worth $1,500 and $2,000 per ton. And at rarer intervals you would see a piece of quartz that had a mass of pure silver in its grip, large as a child's head. More than pure, because it always has a good deal of gold mixed up in its composition. The Weir silver is nature's aristocratic jewelry. The quartz crystallizes and becomes perfectly clear, just as clear and faultless as the diamond, and almost as radiant in beauty. Nature, down there in the depths of the earth, takes one of these quartz rocks, shapes a cavity, and right in its heart imprisons a delicate little coil of serpentine, pure white, aristocratic silver. It was uphill work, this silver mining. There were plenty of mines, but it required a fortune to work one, for tons of worthless rock must be ground to powder to get at the silver. I was the owner of 100 silver mines, yet I realized that I was the poorest man on earth, couldn't sell to anybody, couldn't pay my board. So I had to go to work in a quartz mill at $10 a week. A nice place, truly, for the proprietor of 100 silver mines. I was glad to get that berth, but I couldn't keep it. I don't know why. I was the most careful workman they ever had. They said so. I took more pains with my work than anybody else. I was shoveling sand, tailings as they call it. It is silver-bearing rock that has been ground up and worked over once. It is then saved and worked over again. I was so particular about it that I have sat still for 1 hour and a half and studied about the best way to shovel that sand. And if I couldn't cipher it out in my mind just so, I wouldn't go shoveling around recklessly. I would leave it alone until the next day. Many a time when I have been carrying sand from one pile to another, 30 or 40 feet apart, I would get started with a pailful when a splendid idea would strike me, and I would carry that sand right back and sit down and think about it. Like as not, I would get so absorbed in it as to go to sleep. I almost always go to sleep when I am excited. Why, I always knew there must be some tip-top, first-rate way to move that sand. At last I discovered it. I went to the boss and told him that I had got just the thing, the very best and quickest way to get that sand from one pile to the other, and he says, "I'm awful glad to hear it." You never saw a man so uplifted as he was. It appeared to take a load off his breast, a load of sand, I suppose. And I said, "What you want now is a cast-iron pipe about 13 or 14 feet in diameter and, say, 40 feet long, and you want to prop one end of that pipe up about 35 or 40 feet off the ground, and then you want a revolving belt. Just work it with the waste steam from the engine, a revolving belt with a revolving chair in it. I am to sit in that chair, and have a Chinaman down there to fill up the bucket with sand and pass it up as I come around, and I am just to soar up there and tilt it into that pipe, and there you are. It is as easy as rolling off a log." You never saw a man so overcome with admiration, so overwhelmed. Before he knew what he was about, he discharged me. He said I had too much talent to be fooling away my time in a quartz mill. If you will permit me, I would like to illustrate the ups and downs of the fortune in the mining country with just a little personal experience of my own. I had a cabin mate by the name of Higbee, a splendid good fellow. One morning the camp was thrown into a fearful state of excitement, for the wide West had struck a lead, black with native silver and yellow with gold. The butcher had been dunning us a week or two. Higbee went up and brought a handful away, and he sat studying and examining it, now and then soliloquizing in this manner: "That stuff never came out of the wide West in the world." I told him it did, because I saw them hoist it out of the shaft. Higbee went away by himself, and came back in a couple of hours, perfectly overcome with excitement. He came in, closed the door, went and looked out of the window to make sure there was nobody in the neighborhood, and said to me, "We are worth $1,000,000. The Wide West be hanged. That's a blind lead." Said I, "Higbie, are you really in earnest? Say it again. Say it strong, Higbie." He replied, "Just as sure as I am standing here, it's a blind lead. We're rich." Poverty had vanished, and we could buy that town and pay for it, and 6 more just like it. A blind lead is one that doesn't crop out above the ground, like an ordinary quartz lead. The Wide West had simply tapped it in their shaft, and we had discovered it. It belonged to us. It was our property, and there wouldn't anybody in the camp dispute that fact. We took into partnership the foreman of the Wide West, and the Wide West had to stop digging. We were the Lions of Esmeralda. People wanted to lend us money. Other people wanted to sell us village lots on time, and the butcher brought us meat enough for a barbecue, and went away without his pay. Now, there is a rule that a certain amount of work must be done on a new claim within the first 10 days, or the claim is forfeited to anyone who may first take it up. Now I was called away to nurse an old friend who was dangerously ill at the 9 Mile Ranch, and I just wrote a note and threw it into the window, telling Higbie where I was gone. The fellow I went to nurse was an irascible sort of fellow, and while carrying him from the vapor bath I let my end of him fall. We had a quarrel, and I started for home. When I reached there I saw a vast concourse of people over at the claim, and the thought struck me that we were richer than ever, probably worth $2 million certain. Presently I met Higbie looking like a ghost, and says I, "What on earth is the matter?" "Well," he says, "you didn't do the work on the mine. I depended on you. The foreman's mother dying in California, he didn't do the work. Our claim is forfeited, and we are ruined. We haven't a cent." We went home to the cabin. I looked down at the floor. There was my note, and beside it was a note from Higbie, telling me that he was going away to look for another mine which wouldn't have amounted to anything, even if he had found it, in comparison with our claim. It don't seem possible that there could be 3 as big fools in one small town, but we were there, and I was one of them. For once in my life I was absolutely a millionaire for just 10 days by the watch. I was just ready to go into all kinds of dissipation, and I am really thankful that this was a chapter in the history of my life, although at the time, of course, I did a great deal of weeping and gnashing my teeth. When I lost that $1,000,000, my heart was broken, and I wanted to pine away and die. But I couldn't borrow money to live on while I did so, and I had to give that up. Everything appeared to go against me. Of course, I might have suicided, but that was kind of disagreeable. I had written a few letters for the press, and just in the nick of time I received a letter from the Virginia City Daily Enterprise, offering me $25 a week to go and be a reporter on that paper. I couldn't hardly believe it. But this was no time for foolishness, and I was in for anything. I never had edited anything, but if I had been offered the job of translating Josephus from the original Hebrew, I should have taken it. If I had translated Josephus, I would have thrown in as many jokes as I could for the money, and made him readable. I would have had a variety if I had to write him all up new. Well, I walked that 130 miles in pretty quick time, and took the berth. Have you ever considered what straits reporters are sometimes pushed to in furnishing the public with news? Why, the first day items were so scarce I couldn't find an item anywhere, and just as I was on the verge of despair, as luck would have it, there came in a lot of emigrants with their wagon trains. They had been fighting with the Indians, and got the worst of it. I got the names of their killed and wounded, and then by and by there was another train came in. They hadn't had any trouble, and of course I was disappointed, but I did the best I could under the circumstances. I cross-questioned the boss emigrant and found that they were going right on through and wouldn't come back to make trouble, so I got his list of names and added to my killed and wounded, and I got ahead of all the other papers. I put that wagon train through the bloodiest Indian fight ever seen on the plains. They came out of that conflict covered with glory. The chief editor said he didn't want any better reporter than I was. I said, "You just bring on your Indians and fetch out your emigrants, leave me alone, and I will make the fur fly. I will hang a scalp on every sagebrush between here and the Missouri border." That was all first rate, but by and by items got low again, and I was downhearted. I was miserable, because I couldn't strike an item. At last fortune favored me again. A couple of dear, delightful desperadoes got into a row right before me, and one of them shot the other. I stepped right up there and got the victim to give me his last words, exclusively for the Enterprise, and I added some more to them so as to be sure to get ahead of the other papers. And then I turned to the desperado. Said I, "You are a stranger to me, sir, but you have done me a favor which I can never sufficiently thank you for. I shall ever regard you as a benefactor." And I asked him if he could lend me a $50. We always borrowed a piece whenever we could. It was a public custom. The thought then struck me that I could raise a mob and hang on to the other desperado, but the officers got ahead of me and took him into custody. They were down on us and would always do any little mean thing like that to spite us. And so I was fairly launched in literature, in the business of doing good. I love to do good. It is our duty. I think when a man does good all the time, his conscience is so clear. I like to do right and be good, though there is a deal more fun in the other thing. Now, you see, by my sort of experience, a man may go to bed at night not worth a cent and wake up in the morning to find himself immensely wealthy, and very often he is a man who has a vast cargo of ignorance. To illustrate my point, I will give you a story about a couple of those fresh nabobs whose names are Colonels Jim and Jack. Colonel Jim had seen considerable of the world, but Colonel Jack was raised down in the backwoods of Arkansas. These gentlemen, after their good luck, determined on a pleasure trip to New York. So they went to San Francisco, took a steamer, and in due time arrived in the great metropolis. While passing along the street, Colonel Jack's attention was distracted by the hacks and splendid equipage he saw, and he says, "Well, I've heard about these carriages all my life, and I mean to have a ride in one. I don't care what it costs." So Colonel Jim stepped to the edge of the sidewalk and ordered a handsome carriage. Colonel Jack says, "No, you don't. None of your cheap turnouts for me. I'm here to have a good time, and money's no object. I'm going to have the best rig this country affords. You stop that yellow one there, with the pictures on it." So they got into the empty omnibus and sat down. Colonel Jack says, "Well, ain't it gay? Ain't it nice? Windows and pictures and cushions till you can't rest. What would the boys think of this if they could see us cut such a swell in New York? I wish they could see us. What is the name of this?" Colonel Jim told him it was a barouche. After a while he poked his head out in front and said to the driver, "I say, Johnny, this suits me. We want this shebang all day. Let the horses go." The driver loosened the strap and passed his hand in for the fare. Colonel Jack, thinking that he wanted to shake hands, shook him heartily and said, "You understand me. You take care of me and I'll take care of you." He put a $20 gold piece into the driver's hand. The driver says, "I can't change that." Colonel Jack replied, "Put it into your pocket. I don't want any change. We're going to ride it out." In a few minutes the bus stopped and a young lady got in. Colonel Jack stared at her. Pretty soon she got out her money to pay the driver. Colonel Jack says, "Put up your money, miss. You're perfectly welcome to ride here just as long as you want to. But this barouche is chartered, and we can't let you pay." Soon an old lady got in. Colonel Jack told her to sit down. Don't be at all uneasy. Everything is paid for, and as free as if you were in your own turnout, but you can't pay a cent. Pretty soon 2 or 3 gentlemen got in, and ladies with children. Colonel Jack says, "Come right along, don't mind us, free blowout." By and by the crowd filled all the seats and were standing up, while the others climbed up on top. He nudged the Colonel Jim and says, "Colonel, what kind of cattle do they have here? If this don't bang anything I ever saw. Ain't they friendly, and so awful cool about it? But they ain't sociable." But I have related enough of that circumstance to illustrate the enormous simplicity of those unfledged biddies of fortune. I reported on that morning newspaper 3 years, and it was pretty hard work, but I enjoyed its attractions. Reporting is the best school in the world to get a knowledge of human beings, human nature, and human ways. A nice, gentlemanly reporter (I make no references) is well treated by everybody. Just think of the wide range of his acquaintanceship, his experience of life and society. No other occupation brings a man into such familiar sociable relations with all grades and classes of people. The last thing at night, midnight, he goes browsing around after items among police and jailbirds in the lockup, questioning the prisoners and making pleasant and lasting friendships with some of the worst people on earth. And the very next evening he gets himself up regardless of expense, puts on all the good clothes his friends have got, goes and takes dinner with the governor, or the commander-in-chief of the district, the United States senator, and some more of the upper crust of society. He is on good terms with all of them, and is present at every public gathering, and has easy access to every variety of people. Why, I breakfast almost every morning with the governor, dined with the principal clergyman, and slept in the station-house. A reporter has to lie a little, of course, or they would discharge him. That is the only drawback to the profession. This is why I left it. I am different from Washington. I have a higher and grander standard of principle. Washington could not lie. I can lie, but won't. Reporting is fascinating, but then it is distressing to have to lie so. Lying is bad. Lying is very bad. Every individual in this house knows that by experience. I think that for a man to tell a lie when he can't make anything by it is wrong. When I finished reporting on that paper they made me chief editor. I lasted just a week. I edited that paper 6 days, and then I had 5 duels on my hands. I wouldn't have minded that if it had been the custom for those other people to challenge me. Then I would have simply declined with thanks. But it was not so. If you abused a man in the paper, if you called him names, they had no rights there such as we have. If the man didn't like it, you had to challenge him and shoot him. Of course, I didn't want to do this, but the publisher said it was the custom. Society must be protected. If I could not do the duties of my position, he would have to hire somebody else. I didn't mind the first 3 or 4 men, but the other man, I was after him. I knew he didn't want to fight, so I was going to make all the reputation out of him I could. He got touched at something I said about him. I don't know what it was. I called him a thief, perhaps. He fought very shy of me at first, and so I plied him with bloodthirsty challenges all the more. At last he began to take an interest in this thing. It seemed as though he really was going to enter into it at last. All our boys were delighted at the prospect, but I was not. This was not a turn I was expecting in things. I had taken for my second a fiery, peppery little fellow named Steve, full of fight and anxious to have this thing fixed up right away. He took me over into a little ravine beyond the town to practice. It was the custom to fight with Colt's heavy revolvers at 5 steps. We borrowed a stable door for a mark from a gentleman who was absent. We set up that stable door, and then we propped a fence rail up against the middle to represent my antagonist, and put a squash on it to represent his head. He was a very light, thin man, very thin, the poorest kind of material for a duel. You could not expect to do anything with a scattering shot at all. But he made a splendid line shot, and it was the line that I practiced on principally. And there was no success about it. I could not hit the rail, and there was no need that I should hit the rail. The rail did not really represent him. It was a little too thin and narrow. But the squash was all right. Well, I could not hit the rail, and I could not hit the squash, and finally, when I found I could not hit the door either, I got a little discouraged. But when I noticed that I crippled one of the boys occasionally, I thought it was not so bad. I was dangerous with a pistol, but not reliable. Finally we heard some shooting going on over in the other ravine. We knew what that meant. The other party was practicing. I didn't feel comfortable. They might straggle over the ridge and see what was going on, and when they saw no bullet hole in the barn door, it would be too much encouragement for them. Just then a little bird, a little larger than a sparrow, lit on the sagebrush near by. Steve whipped out his revolver and shot its head off. The boys picked up the bird, and we were talking about it, when the other dueling party came over the ridge, came down to see what was going on. When the second saw the bird, he said, "How far off was it?" Steve said about 30 steps. "Who did that?" "Why, Twain, man, of course." "Did he indeed? Can he do that often?" "Well, he can do that about 4 times in 5. I knew that little rascal was lying, but I didn't like to tell him so. I was one of those kind of men that don't like to be too frank or too familiar in a matter like that, so I didn't say anything. But it was a comfort to see those fellows' underjaws drop, to see them turn blue about the gills and look sick. They went off and got their man and took him home, and when I got home I found a little note from those parties peremptorily declining the fight. How sore the boys were! How indignant they were! And so was I. But I was not distressed about it. I thought I could stand it, perhaps. Well, I was out of that scrape, and I didn't want to get into any more of them. I turned the other 4 duels over to Steve, who wanted them. But when those people found out afterward that he did that shooting, he didn't get any good out of his duels. They wouldn't fight him. All that was in my younger days, when I didn't know much, which I do now. I didn't know any better then, but now I am bitterly opposed to dueling. I think that dueling is immoral, and has a bad tendency, and I think it is every man's duty to frown down and discourage dueling. I do. I discourage it on all occasions. If a man were to challenge me now, I would go and take that man by the hand and lead him to a quiet private room and kill him. Ladies and gentlemen, after thanking you heartily for the attention you have given me this evening, I desire to wish you a very pleasant good night, and at the same time assure you earnestly that I have told nothing but the truth, and I have hardly exaggerated that. Alternate conclusion, following the story of Colonel Jack and Colonel Jim. When I told the chairman of the society this evening that I wanted to change my subject, he said it was a little risky. He didn't know about it. But I pleaded so hard and said the only reason was I didn't want to talk that Artemus Ward lecture because it had been printed in the papers. I told him that I would put in a little scrap from the Artemus Ward lecture, just enough to cover the advertisement, and then I wouldn't be telling any lies. Besides, this anecdote had a moral to it. Well, that moral got him. As nearly as I can cipher it out, the newspaper reporter has got us lecturers at a disadvantage. He can either make a synopsis or do most anything he wants to. He ought to be generous, and praise us or abuse us, but not print our speeches. Artemus Ward was bothered by a shorthand reporter, and he begged him not to do him the injustice to garble his speech. He says, "You can't take it all down as I utter it." The reporter said, "If you utter anything I can't take down, I will agree not to print the speech." Along in the lecture he tipped the reporter a wink, and he told the following anecdote: "Whistle wherever the stars occur. If you can't, get somebody that can." He said that several gentlemen were conversing in a hotel parlor, and one man sat there who didn't have anything to say. By and by the gentlemen all went out except one of the number and the silent man. Presently the man reached out and touched the gentleman and says, "I think, sir, I have seen you somewhere before. I am not sure where it was or when it was, but I know I have seen you." The gentleman says, "Very likely, but what do you whistle for?" "I'll tell you all about it. I used to stammer fearfully, and I courted a girl, and she wouldn't have me because I was afflicted with such a infirmity. I went to a doctor, and he told me that every time I went to stammer that I must whistle, which I did, and it completely cured me. But Don't you know that girl wouldn't have me at last, for she said that she wouldn't talk to a man that whistled as I did. She'd as soon hold a conversation with a wheelbarrow that wanted greasing. Ladies and gentlemen, for 3 or 4 days I have had it in my mind to throw away that other lecture, but I never had the pluck to do it until tonight. The audience seemed to look friendly, and as I had been here before, I felt a little acquainted. I thought I would make the venture. I sincerely thank you for the help you have given me, and I bid you good night. End of Roughing It lecture, read by John Greenman. This is Section 12 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Governor Nye, Steinway Hall, New York, January 24, 1872. Read by John Greenman. He was a real father to those poor Nevada Indians. He gave them, without regard to their sex or age, blankets and hoop-skirts. You could see an Indian chief with a string of blacking boxes around his neck, and over his red blanket 4 or 5 of those hoop-skirts, walking the streets as happy as a clam, with his hands sticking out of the slats. And yet, notwithstanding all the efforts and civilizing kindness of the good governor, those Indians didn't step out of their savage condition. They were just as degraded as if they had never seen a hoop-skirt. End of On Governor Nye, read by John Greenman. This is Section 13 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dinner Speech. The Aldine Dinner, St. James Hotel, New York, early February 1872. Read by John Greenman. Gentlemen, I would rather address a stag dinner party than any other assemblage in the world, for the reason that when you make a point, those who have been listening always applaud, and those who have been talking to each other and did not hear it applaud louder than anybody else, and if I only had a speech prepared for this occasion, I would take genuine delight in delivering it. But I got the notification to be present at this dinner this evening at 11:30 this morning, to pay what I owe to the Aldine establishment, and I had to leave an hour after that in order that I might take the trip, so I had no opportunity to prepare a speech, and I am not one of those geniuses who can make a speech impromptu. I have made a great many happy impromptu speeches, but I had time to prepare them. Now, it is singular, and I suppose that, but for circumstances that happened when I was 14 years of age, I might have rushed blindly into real impromptu speeches and injured myself a good deal. This circumstance, which happened when I was 14 years of age, has always protected me against anything of that kind, and it has led me to think a good deal. Now, I don't think a good deal, generally, of what may probably be the moving springs of human nature. I put that in merely because it is a good expression. I mean, it has led me to question in my own mind what may probably have been the incidents in a man's life which have remained with him longest, whether they are important incidents or whether they are merely trivial ones. I have almost come to the conclusion that the things that stay longest by man, and shape his action in after life, are really things of trivial importance. Now, I call your attention to the fact, in support of this argument, that Newton, when he was, I don't know what he was doing now. I make no insinuations against Newton. I don't know what he was doing in the apple orchard, but you know he saw the apple fall, and that suggested the idea of the attraction of gravitation. I call your attention again to that expression, and then again, one of the greatest inventors that ever lived, I'm sorry for your instruction, I cannot tell his name, was led into this matter of gravitation by having to wait upon his mother while she was hearing confession, and seeing the pendulum move back and forward, there was nothing else for him to contemplate, and that set him into this matter of looking at mechanics, and he invented a great many things. I don't know what they were. Now it was trivial, you know. And Galileo, loafing around in the cathedral at Pisa, not knowing what he was there for, or how he was putting in his time, but he saw and took note of the gentle vibration of the chandelier to and fro, and through that invented the pendulum, which is understood to have made a revolution in mechanics, and I suppose it has. I take these learned things for granted. All these are trivial matters, but they brought about vast results. Now, the thing that made the deepest impression on my mind, and has lasted until this moment, was a matter itself essentially trivial. It occurred when I was a boy, and it has protected me, up to this time, against making a speech when I hadn't a speech prepared. It was a remark made by a friend. He said, "I could have ketched them cats if I had on a good ready." Now, at first glance, that didn't appear to convey an idea, but it does, and the meat of it is this: don't do anything unless you are prepared to do it. Therefore, until this moment, I never made a speech unless I had that speech all set down and ready. This incident is of no consequence to you at all, and yet I never made a speech in my life unless I tried to inculcate a moral, unless I tried to convey instruction. And if I can make you better men than you are, it is not for me to say there is room for it, though I suppose there is. If I can make you wiser than you are, or if I can protect you in after life as I have been protected, let me do it here, even if I perish on the spot. Now, this thing occurs in this wise. As trivial as it is a matter to be treasured, I think, and remembered. When I was 14, as I remarked before, I was living with my parents, who were very poor and correspondingly honest. We had a youth living with us by the name of Jim Wolfe. He was an excellent fellow, 17 years old, and very diffident. He and I slept together, virtuously, and one very bitter winter's night, a cousin Mary of mine, she's married now and gone, gave what they called a candy-pulling in those days in the West, and they took the saucers of hot candy outside of the house into the snow under a sort of old bower that came out from the eaves. It was a sort of an L then, all covered with vines, to cool this hot candy in the snow. And they were all sitting around there, and in the meantime we were gone to bed. we were not invited to attend this party. We were too young. All these young ladies and gentlemen assembled there, and Jim and I were in bed. There was about 4 inches of snow on this L, and our window looked out onto it, and it was frozen hard. A couple of tomcats, it is possible one of them might have been the other sex, were assembled on the chimney in the middle of this L, and they were growling at a fearful rate, and switching their tails about and going on, and we couldn't sleep at all. Finally Jim said, for 2 cents I'd go out and snake them cats off that chimney. So I said, of course you would. Well, he said, well, I would. I have a mighty good notion to do it. Says I, of course you have. Certainly you have. You have a great notion to do it. I hoped he might try it, but I was afraid he wouldn't. Finally I did get his ambition up, and he raised the window and climbed out on that icy roof, with nothing on but his socks and a very short shirt. He went climbing along on all fours on the roof towards this chimney where the cats were. In the meantime these young ladies and gentlemen were enjoying themselves down under the eaves, and when Jim got almost to that chimney he made a pass at the cats, and his heels flew up, and he shot down and crashed through those vines, and lit in the midst of the ladies and gentlemen, and sat down in those hot saucers of candy, and there was a general stampede, of course, and he came upstairs dropping pieces of chinaware and candy all the way up, and when he got up there, and now anybody in the world would have gone into profanity or something calculated to relieve the mind under such circumstances, but he didn't. He scraped the candy off his legs, nursed his blisters a little, and said, I could have ketched them cats if I had on a good ready. Now, I say this, that if the opportunity had so fallen out that I could have had ample opportunity to get up a speech, I could have gotten up a speech that would have sent you all home happy or otherwise. I could have gotten up a speech that would have done honor to this occasion, and to me, but under the circumstances I have had no opportunity, and I could not get up such a speech. But as long as you live, if you remember the circumstances at all, you will remember that if I had on a good ready, I would have caught these literary cats here present. Now, I won't bore you any further, but I will simply say that I am glad to be present here, glad to help to celebrate this occasion, the new era of enlarged prosperity for the Aldine, and also the calling to the editorial chair of a gentleman of culture like Mr. Stoddard, and I am glad to be able to sit with so bright a company as this, and hope you will excuse further remarks from yours truly. End of dinner speech read by John Greenman. This is section 14 of Mark Twain speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dinner speech, Whitefriars Club, London, circa October 1872. Read by John Greenman. Gentlemen, I thank you very heartily indeed for this expression of kindness toward me. What I have done for England and civilization in the arduous affairs which I have engaged in, that is good. That is so smooth that I will say it again and again. What I have done for England and civilization in the arduous part I have performed, I have done with a simple-hearted devotion and no hope of reward. I am proud, I am very proud, that it was reserved for me to find Dr. Livingstone, and for Mr. Stanley to get all the credit. I hunted for that man in Africa all over 75 or 100 parishes, thousands and thousands of miles in the wilds and deserts, all over the place, sometimes riding negroes and sometimes traveling by rail. I didn't mind the rail or anything else, so that I didn't come in for the tar and feathers. I found that man at Ujiji, a place you may remember if you have ever been there, and it was a very great satisfaction that I found him just in the nick of time. I found that poor old man deserted by his niggers and by his geographers, deserted by all of his kind except the gorillas, dejected, miserable, famished, absolutely famishing. But he was eloquent. Just as I found him he had eaten his last elephant, and he said to me, "God knows where I shall get another." He had nothing to wear except his venerable and honorable naval suit, and nothing to eat but his diary. But I said to him, "It's all right. I have discovered you, and Stanley will be here by the 4 o'clock train, and will discover you officially, and then we will turn to and have a regular good time." I said, "Cheer up, for Stanley has got corn, ammunition, glass beads, hymn books, whiskey, and everything which the human heart can desire. He has got all kinds of valuables, including telegraph poles, and a few cartloads of money. By this time communication has been made with the land of Bibles and civilization, and property will advance." And then we surveyed all that country from Ujiji through Unanogo and other places to Unyanembe. I mention these names simply for your edification, nothing more. Do not expect it, particularly as intelligence to the Royal Geographic Society. And then, having filled up the old man, we were all too full for utterance, and departed. We have since then feasted on honors. Stanley has received a snuff-box, and I have received considerable snuff. He has got to write a book and gather in the rest of the credit, and I am going to levy on the copyright and to collect the money. Nothing comes amiss to me, cash or credit, but seriously, I do feel that Stanley is the chief man, and an illustrious one, and I do applaud him with all my heart, whether he is an American or a Welshman by birth, or one or both, matters not to me. So far as I am personally concerned, I am simply here to stay a few months and to see English people and to learn English manners and customs, and to enjoy myself. So the simplest thing I can do is to thank you for the toast you have honored me with, and for the remarks you have made, and to wish health and prosperity to the Whitefriars Club, and to sink down to my accustomed level. End of dinner speech, read by John Greenman. This is section 15 of Mark Twain Speaking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After dinner speech, Meeting of Americans, London, July 4, 1873. Read by John Greenman. Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the compliment which has just been tendered me, and to show my appreciation of it, I will not afflict you with many words. It is pleasant to celebrate in this peaceful way, upon this old mother soil, the anniversary of an experiment which was born of war with this same land so long ago, and wrought out to a successful issue by the devotion of our ancestors. It has taken nearly 100 years to bring the English and Americans into kindly and mutually appreciative relations, but I believe it has been accomplished at last. It was a great step when the two last misunderstandings were settled by arbitration instead of cannon. It is another great step when England adopts our sewing machines without claiming the invention as usual. It was another when they imported one of our sleeping cars the other day, and it warmed my heart more than I can tell, yesterday, when I witnessed the spectacle of an Englishman ordering an American sherry cobbler of his own free will and accord. And not only that, but with a great brain and level head, reminding the barkeeper not to forget the strawberries. With a common origin, a common literature, a common religion, and common drinks, what is longer needful to the cementing of the two nations together in a permanent bond of brotherhood? This is an age of progress, and ours is a progressive land. A great and glorious land, too, a land which has developed a Washington, a Franklin, a William M. Tweed, a Longfellow, a Motley, a Jay Gould, a Samuel C. Pomeroy, a recent Congress which has never had its equal, in some respects, and a United States Army which conquered 60 Indians in 8 months by tiring them out, which is much better than uncivilized slaughter, God knows. We have a criminal jury system which is superior to any in the world, and its efficiency is only marred by the difficulty of finding 12 men every day who don't know anything and can't read. And I may observe that we have an insanity plea that would have saved Cain. I think I can say, and say with pride, that we have some legislatures that bring higher prices than any in the world. I refer with effusion to our railway system, which consents to let us live, though it might do the opposite, being our owners. It only destroyed 3,070 lives last year by collisions, and 27,260 by running over heedless and unnecessary people at crossings. The companies seriously regretted the killing of these 30,000 people, and went so far as to pay for some of them, voluntarily, of course, for the meanest of us would not claim that we possess a court treacherous enough to enforce a law against a railway company. But thank heaven, the railway companies are generally disposed to do the right and kindly thing without compulsion. I know of an instance which greatly touched me at the time. After an accident, the company sent home the remains of a dear, distant, old relative of mine in a basket, with the remark, "Please state what figure you hold him at, and return the basket." Now, there couldn't be anything friendlier than that. But I must not stand here and brag all night. However, you won't mind a body bragging a little about his country on the 4th of July. It is a fair and legitimate time to fly the eagle. I will say only one more word of brag, and a hopeful one. It is this: we have a form of government which gives each man a fair chance and no favor. With us no individual is born with a right to look down upon his neighbor and hold him in contempt. Let such of us as are not dukes find our consolation in that, and we may find hope for the future in the fact that, as unhappy as is the condition of our political morality today, England has risen up out of a far fouler since the days when Charles II ennobled courtesans and all political place was a matter of bargain and sale. Be sure there is hope for us yet. Footnote: At least the above is the speech which I was going to make, but our minister, General Schenck, presided, and after the blessing got up and made a great, long, inconceivably dull harangue, and wound up by saying that inasmuch as speech-making did not seem to exhilarate the guests much, all further oratory would be dispensed with during the evening, and we could just sit and talk privately to our elbow neighbors and have a good sociable time. It is known that in consequence of that remark 44 perfected speeches died in the womb. The depression, the gloom, the solemnity that reigned over the banquet from that time forth will be a lasting memory with many that were there. By that one thoughtless remark General Schenck lost 44 of the best friends he had in England. More than one said that night, "And this is the sort of person that is sent to represent us in a great sister empire?" End of after-dinner speech, read by John Greenman.